So obviously competitive Pokemon depends a lot on your Pokemon's stats. A Pokemon's IVs, EVs, and natures all factor in. And if you don't know what those are, you can check out my video on that, link right up there. But beyond those things, when you prepare a Pokemon to be brought into the competitive scene, you also want to pay attention to things like its ability and its moves. So that's what this video is going to focus on. I'm going to explain some of the ins and outs of Pokemon abilities and moves, and I'm also going to touch on some things that are not as important in some cases, but you still need to know. Namely, variations between Pokemon forms, and how to get Pokemon of various Tera types, because terrestrialization is actually pretty important to the current meta. I'm going to start with abilities because this is actually a pretty straightforward topic. So when abilities were first introduced, a Pokemon would have 1 to 2 abilities depending on the species. Those that have 1 always have that particular ability, and those that have 2 have that ability chosen at random when they're generated. However, starting in Generation 5, a new type of ability was introduced, a Pokemon's hidden ability. Initially, this was linked to the now defunct Pokemon Dream World. Since then, however, Game Freak has changed the various ways that you can get these abilities. The primary way you get them now, no surprise, is through raids. Like with IVs, Pokemon with hidden abilities can be found in higher star raids. However, let's say you want to take a Pokemon and breed it. Can it still have its hidden ability? The answer to that question actually is yes. When you breed a Pokemon with one of its regular abilities, the mother, that is either the female or the non-ditto Pokemon, has an 80% chance of passing that particular ability down. In the case of hidden abilities, the odds are 60%. However, say you don't want to go through breeding, especially because the breeding mechanics in Scarlet and Violet are kind of annoying and I don't quite understand how they work. I miss the old way of just running back and forth until the daycare man tells you you have an egg. Either way though, the 2 ways you can change a Pokemon's ability after it's been obtained are through the ability capsule and ability patch items. The ability capsule works for Pokemon with one of its regular abilities. By using this item, you can switch from one of those abilities to the other. This obviously only works with Pokemon that have 2 possible abilities. In the case of the ability patch, when it was first introduced, this was meant for taking a Pokemon with one of its regular abilities and switching to its hidden ability. However, as of Scarlet and Violet, it also works in the reverse order. You can take a Pokemon that has a hidden ability and revert it back to one of its normal abilities. In the case of a Pokemon with 2 possible abilities, it'll pick the ability in the first slot. That is, if you were to go on Bulbapedia or Cerebi and look at a Pokemon's information page, the first of the 2 abilities listed is the one it will go to. But obviously from there you can just use an ability capsule if that's not the one you want. Interestingly enough, unlike with Hyper Training or Mints, a Pokemon that has its ability changed with the ability patch actually can pass the hidden ability down through breeding. Either way though, we gotta move on to moves. So, Pokemon learn moves in various ways. By leveling up, some will learn moves specifically when they evolve. Different games have move tutors that can teach special moves. And obviously you've got TMs, which are now single use again. However, they are now infinitely purchasable from the TM machine. You need to bring a couple things to make a TM. You first need a certain amount of league points depending on the particular move in question, as well as a specific set of materials to craft the TM with. These are obtained by catching or defeating wild Pokemon throughout the Paldea region. There is a third thing you need though. You need to have actually obtained the TM at least once. However, once that condition is met, you can make as many as you want provided you have sufficient materials. However, my guess is that's not really the thing you guys are concerned with. The real thing you want to know about is the case of egg moves. So the way egg moves worked when they were first conceived of is that when they were done in a male-female mating pair, that is, no dittos involved, the male Pokemon, which could be of any species so long as it's in the same egg group as the female, could pass down certain moves to the baby that it could not learn otherwise. And that's all well and good. However, there are a specific subset of Pokemon that are either gender unknown or exclusively male, which meant they were essentially excluded from egg moves. However, that changed. The current Generation 9 mechanics is that by holding the Mirror Herb item and having a picnic, a Pokemon can pick up any of its egg moves from any of the members of your party you have out. This makes learning these moves extremely easy. All you need is this one item and a Pokemon with the correct move. It's honestly quite simple to the point where why would you ever consider breeding for egg moves again? The big caveat though is, unlike Pokemon hatched with egg moves, Pokemon who learn moves this way will not be able to relearn them when they forget those moves. However, if you end up deleting one of those moves and then later decide, hey, I actually want this move for my set, it's quite easy to actually get that particular move. One last thing you do need to know is that you usually need to remove a move from your move pool before you do this. Beyond that, there are certain event Pokemon that come with moves that they just can't learn otherwise. The thing you have to be careful though is when a Pokemon goes through Pokemon Home, the game actually saves different iterations of its moveset. So if you were to transfer Pokemon from, say, Sword and Shield or Legends Arceus into Scarlet and Violet, it would have its moves completely reset. However, it would regain those moves once it's transferred back to its original game. So those are the two major topics I wanted to talk about. The last couple things I want to talk about are Pokemon with specific forms. Obviously, I'm not concerned about Pokemon that can change their forms. Pokemon like Rotom or Calyrex have a fairly easy way to switch between their various forms. However, some Pokemon have permanent forms that can't be changed, like say Lycanroc or any of the various regional forms. So I'm going to start with all the forms that are non-regional. So obviously, a Pokemon caught with that form can't have their form changed at all. However, in the case of breeding, the way the forms are passed down is usually determined by the female Pokemon. So say you have two Shellos, one is East Sea, one is West Sea, and if you breed those two, whichever one was female is what the baby will be. However, that is not the case, strangely enough, for regional forms, which makes absolutely no sense, but this one's fairly easy to work with as well. Typically, when a Pokemon hatches from an egg, it hatches with the form that is native to that particular region. That is to say, a Wooper hatched in Paldea will always be Paldean Wooper. However, there are ways to get a Johto Wooper if you so desire. The way you do that is by taking a Wooper or Quagsire and having it hold the Everstone. That will force it to hatch to the regional form of that particular Pokemon. The big caveat though is Pokemon that don't have regional forms all the way through their evolution line are not actually able to get their specific regional forms out of eggs. So cases like Alolan Raichu need to be transferred in. It's unfortunate, but that is currently the way it stands. Moving on to our final topic, Tera types are usually just generated as one of the two types of that particular Pokemon species. Note that the game doesn't care about any potential evolution type changes. It cares only about the species in question. However, there are ways to get Pokemon with non-traditional Tera types. Obviously, there are the wild terrestrial Pokemon that can be found out in the wild, as well as through raids. However, say you want to take a Pokemon that isn't found in raids, like say one of the starters, and terrestrialize that into a different type. How do you do that? Well, this is by far the grindiest of all the things you would need to do. What you want to do is you actually want to partake in raids of that particular type that you desire. That is, say you have a Skeledirge that you want to be Tera Fairy. You would then go out into the region and take on as many Fairy raids as possible. Higher star raids usually yield more shards. And eventually, by doing this over and over again, you should be able to get enough shards to change your Pokemon's Tera type. But how many is that number? 50. The number is 50. So, yeah, it's not fun. Either way, though, once you manage to get those shards, what you want to do is you want to go to this guy here in Medali and give him 50 shards of the type that you desire. And from there, the Pokemon's Tera type is changed. And unlike most of the other things, Tera types can't be bred, so this is the only way to change them or control them outside of raids. And obviously, this is going to not matter in a couple of years when we're into Generation 10 and we have a new regional gimmick. But for now, to play in the Scarlet and Violet metagame, that's what you have to put up with. And with that, that covers everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video because next time we're going to finally actually get to talk about team building. I have gone through all of the individual topics that you need to know in order to actually get Pokemon with the desired sets. So now we need to talk about what those sets actually are. And so I will see you next time.